All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And welcome to our second webinar in the three-part series featuring the work of Barry Goldstein and Veronica York. Today, they're going to be covering the family court practices and the increased domestic violence homicides. My name is Ashley Rumschlag. I'm the National Director of domesticshelters.org at the Alliance for Hope International. I'm joined by Hannah Craig, our Director of Content, and our Senior Digital Services Specialist, Rachel Myers. I just wanted to give a pause to take a moment to give a huge thanks to Rachel and Hannah for making sure that the webinar series continued full steam ahead over the summer while I took some time away. So thank you, ladies. This webinar is being presented by domesticshelters.org, and today's presentation is a part of our free monthly webinar series. Check out the Watch Webinar section of our website to see our past webinars, and you can still even get a certificate of attendance by sending us an email. domesticshelters.org is a program of Alliance for Hope International, where we focus on creating communities of safety, hope, and healing. You can check out allianceforhope.org to learn more about the Alliance's other programs and access a huge library of professional resources available to you. Just a few reminders before we get started. We do have live closed captionings to enable. Just please click the show captions. We'll also provide a transcript within a week of the presentation. This is a Zoom webinar, as we're all familiar with by now. All attendees are in listen-only mode. And please direct your questions to the Q&A section. That really helps us to make sure they don't get lost in the chatter in the chat. So if you have a question for our presenters, please click the Q&A box and enter your question there. And then the chat, like I said, can be used to communicate between attendees. We do email a transcript, a certificate, the webinar playback recording, and any additional resources referenced today within 1 week of the presentation. So before next Thursday, you'll have those in your inbox. And just a reminder, we are going to get together again. Like I mentioned, this is a three-part series. So next week will be the final part where Barry and Veronica are going to talk about the high cost we pay to tolerate domestic violence. Rachel's going to drop a link to register for that in the chat so you can get signed up, and that way we can see you back next week. All right, so I have a very important announcement to make, and then we're going to move along quickly. But I just wanted to share this message for all of our domestic violence advocates, staff members, directors who are located here in the U.S. We are excited to share an opportunity to apply for our first ever Q4 Verizon Skill Forward competition. So for those of you not familiar, Alliance for Hope International recently received a grant to promote the Verizon Skill Forward program. It is a free, as I said it right, FREE free upskilling initiative offering offering professional development courses in areas like AI and social work, psychology, Spanish, leadership, data analytics, coding, and so much more. The program is open to your clients, staff, friends, family members, anyone who can benefit from building new skills for the future of work. Here's how the competition will work. So each selected organization will receive a site-specific registration link to share widely. This link will automatically track anyone who you sign up for Verizon Skill Forward, and then track also if they completed a course. The organization that helps the most learners complete a course will win a grand prize. So basically, first place could win up to $10,000, depending on how many learners you get to complete a course. The more learners you engage, the larger the reward could be. We'll also award prizes to second and third place based on their performance. And to help you promote the program, we'll give you ready-made marketing materials like email templates and flyers that can be customized and shared throughout your network. So this is a chance not only to bring valuable upskilling opportunities to your community, but also to win additional funds to support your organization. So if you're interested, Rachel's going to drop a link in the chat where you can apply to be considered to participate in that competition. And we'll make sure everyone's notified by September 15th if you are selected. All right. So I do want to refresh your memory for those of you that well, it's been a week, so a little bit of time has passed, but also for those who weren't here last week, I want to make sure you're very acquainted with the background of Barry and Veronica. So I'm going to go through their bios again. I know Hannah read those last week, but Barry Goldstein is a wonderful friend of domesticshelters.org and is a member of our editorial advisory group that reviews all the articles and content on domesticshelters.org. Barry is a domestic violence author, speaker, advocate, and expert witness who has worked in the DV movement for 42 years with a focus on broken custody court system, as well as serving as an instructor in a batterer prevention program or batterer program for 21 years. Barry is the author of 6 books, with his new book, Preventing Domestic Violence and Child Abuse, Medical, Law Enforcement, Judicial, and Human Benefits, co-edited by Therese Hannah, Veronica York. This will be published very soon. He is also the author of The Safe Child Act, a comprehensive plan to solve the child custody court problem. Barry is a partner in Goldstein and York and has been qualified as an expert witness in 31 states. As I mentioned, we're also joined by Veronica York. Veronica is a dedicated domestic violence author, speaker, and expert. As partner at Goldstein and York, she serves as an expert witness in custody cases involving allegations of domestic violence and child abuse. She is currently qualified as an expert in 10 states. Veronica is also co-owner of York Consulting and Family Services and provides services as a certified high conflict divorce coach and family law mediator. As a survivor of domestic violence, Veronica deeply understands the challenges posed by the family court system's harmful response to domestic violence custody cases. She is passionate about advocating for systemic change, including improved training and education for court professionals on domestic violence and its impact. All right, without further ado, Barry and Veronica, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. And just thank you so much for being so generous with your time with this series. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. As part of our work in preparing the book, we found a lot of new information, new research, and we wanted to get that information out because we think it's really game-changing. And next week, as Ashley mentioned, we're going to talk about the financial cost of domestic violence, which is way more than previously understood. And in fact, you're going to find out how you can share in that savings, which would mean each of us would save $11,000 a year, which would make a huge difference in everybody's life. But today, we want to talk about what we found in terms of the connection between the failure of family courts in domestic violence cases, their failure to protect abused women and their children, and that has had a huge consequence to the DV homicide rate. And the research is very clear, and we're going to be showing that shortly. And we think this is a game changer. And we wanted to present it to a domestic violence audience because if you think about it, preventing domestic violence homicides really goes to the essence of your work. And I think until we saw this research, we didn't have clear evidence that the failures in the custody court system were causing domestic violence homicides. And fundamentally, what happened was that at the start of the domestic violence movement, through your work, there were a number of reforms that made it easier for women to leave their abusers. And that led to a steady reduction in domestic violence homicide. And the ability of abusers to use and to manipulate the courts to prevent women from escaping has resulted in reversing 3 decades of progress, so that now we're at the highest domestic violence homicide rate. And that's horrific. So someone posted in Facebook, just how horrible that finding is. And they're right, but it's also an opportunity. Knowing the connection between custody court failures and DV homicides is an opportunity to change that and save a large number of lives. And that's what we hope to do in sharing this information in this webinar, because the people here who are part of this audience are exactly the people who need this information and can help use it to change everything. And that's really what we're trying to do. Veronica?
Thank you, Barry. So I want to talk about how initially, when the DV movement first became a public issue back in the 1970s, we were doing a lot of things that were going to help victims leave their abusers and be able to be supported. And in being able to escape their abusers, obviously that was the start of domestic violence homicide rates being on the decrease. And so at that time, there were specific laws and practices developed that, again, would make it easier for victims to leave. And again, this was from the 1970s up until the 1990s, early 2000s. And we were able to help victims get protective orders. There were movements as far as, making domestic violence a crime, having consequences and accountability for abusers, prosecuting abusers, getting economic support for survivors and their children, getting them shelter, place to go, maintaining custody of their children, which is a huge thing that really helped because it allowed mothers to leave and know that they could keep their children safe rather than leave and then not be able to be there for their children, being with the abuser unsupervised. And so a lot of these changes were being made and helping women escape their abusers and maintain some level of safety. These practices resulted, as I said, in a steady decline of homicide rates, but not just for women, but also for men. And later in the presentation, Barry's going to go over those numbers, and we'll see that the homicide rates for men were absolutely going down as well. And so we were making a lot of progress. But unfortunately, on the next slide, Barry's going to talk about what happened to make things change.
Okay, so the reforms that Veronica mentioned resulted in making it easier for particularly women to leave their abusers. And not surprisingly, abusers didn't like that. They believed that women had no right to leave. And so they developed a particularly cruel practice to try to regain power and control. And what they did was they went after custody as a way to regain power and control. Many of our clients have mentioned to us that their abuser told them, if you dare to leave, we're going to take custody and we're going to bankrupt you. And all too often, the courts are letting them be successful in doing that. And so, in order to be successful in manipulating the courts, the abusers developed a number of specific tactics. Probably the most horrible, the most effective has been biased and unscientific alienation theories. And it's not just that these theories have no scientific research, so they're not reliable, but they were deliberately designed to help abusive fathers take custody from good mothers. So part of their theory is that you only look at the mother's behavior, all the things that the fathers are doing to ruin their relationship with the children needs to be ignored, just as they want to use this to distract attention from domestic violence and child abuse, which are the real causes of their bad relationship with the children. As part of the alienation theories, they promoted the cottage industry of legal and mental health professionals who found that they could make large incomes by helping abusive fathers. And of course, abusers tend to have more financial resources. And the context here is that domestic violence is based on control, including financial control. And that's why abusive fathers have most of the money in these cases. The cottage industry is seeking approaches that favor abusive fathers so they can get that money. Because if you're unethical, if you don't care about hurting children, then you need these biased practices to take money from abusive fathers. And that's what's going on. And the courts aren't recognizing it. Another part of the tactics is shared parenting and high conflict narratives. And the problem with these is that they create a false narrative, a false equivalency between safe, protective mothers who are the primary attachment figure for the children and abusive fathers. And creating this false equivalency gives abusers another unfair advantage. Another thing we see is that attorneys for abusers use very aggressive litigation strategies. They're asking for extreme actions that harm the children, and the courts don't seem to notice that that shows the father's motives, that they're willing to hurt the children in order to regain power and control. And a big part of the problem in the family courts is that abusers have promoted the myth that mothers frequently make false reports of abuse. And this is absolutely untrue. The Ballas study, which is the leading study in the field, found that in contested custody cases, mothers make deliberate false reports less than 2% of the time. At the same time, fathers in contested custody are 16 times more likely to make deliberate false reports. And yet, court professionals have great skepticism when mothers talk about abuse because of this myth, and at the same time are accepting the father's statements as if they were credible, just the opposite of what the research shows. Veronica?
Thank you, Barry. So now I want to talk about how specifically family court failures are undermining all of the good work that we initially did in trying to decrease domestic violence homicides. So one of the major issues is the failure for courts to update their practices with research that we currently have, scientific research and evidence-based solutions, and using the correct experts. So when Barry and I testify, we talk a lot about the ACE research, which is adverse childhood experiences, and we talk about the Saunders study, because the Saunders study was a study out of the U.S. Justice Department that assessed the domestic violence knowledge of judges, lawyers, and particularly custody evaluators. Because back in the 1970s, again, when this first became a public issue, at that time when there was no research, the popular assumption was that domestic violence was caused by either mental illness or substance abuse. And of course, the reason for that was because when you have mental illness or substance abuse, it can make the abuse much more severe. But we now know with the research that's not the cause of domestic violence when those things are obviously present. You need to address those issues, but there's separate issues. Domestic violence is caused by a belief system, more of an entitlement. Again, like Barry said, it's about power and control. So abusers really believe that they have every right to abuse their partner if their partner does not do what they want them to do, and they can't control what their partner is doing. So that belief system is the cause of domestic violence, and the research shows that only accountability and monitoring can change that type of behavior. So the failure of courts to update their practices when in regards to domestic violence is really causing harm to children, because they are not using the right experts. Instead of using domestic violence experts and advocates who understand the dynamics of domestic violence, they're turning to mental health professionals who do not have specific knowledge in domestic violence that's needed. And so therefore they're coming to decisions and recommendations that are harming children. And so we need to update our practices with the research that says we need the right experts, that says we need to have courts understand very specific knowledge of domestic violence, like how to screen properly for domestic violence, how to understand risk assessment, post-separation abuse, and the impact of domestic violence on children. Right now, mostly courts, particularly family courts, are focusing on physical abuse. And we know that most domestic violence is neither physical nor is it illegal. And when there's no convictions of domestic violence, then courts tend to just ignore any allegations of abuse, or minimize the harm that it's caused and move on to other things that they're more comfortable with. So misunderstanding the nature of these domestic violence cases is really causing harm to children, because courts are pushing shared parenting type ideologies without this particular information. And to be fair, I'm going to address a context here that we want to make sure is out there, and that is that most contested custody cases are handled more or less amicably. It's only about 3.8% of most of contested custody cases that are going to require trial, and often much more. And 75 to 90% of those cases are really domestic violence cases. So when courts are seeing 100% of their cases, this is a very small percentage of the cases they're seeing. And unfortunately, they're treating these cases just same as other cases, or they're labeling them as high conflict, which insinuates that both parties are a problem and both parties are unreasonable. And that's just not the case in domestic violence cases. Barry also mentioned the unscientific alienation theories that are being done. Those theories are allowing abusers to really use that tactic to gain control and to gain custody over good protective mothers who are just trying to protect their children. In withholding them from their abusers, they're being accused, for protection reasons, they're being accused of alienation. And that is really detrimental, obviously, for the children. Barry didn't also mention the inequality. Courts are creating this false equivalency between an abuser and a victim when they're trying to impose shared parenting ideologies when it's not appropriate. Obviously, tolerating gender bias, there has been 41 states that have done committees in the courts about gender bias, and they all found widespread gender bias. And the most common examples of that were giving women less credibility, holding women to a higher standard of proof, and blaming women for the actions of their abusers. And then I want to talk about retaliating, because that's a huge part of the failure of family courts, is retaliating against protective mothers when they are bringing up allegations of abuse. So a lot of times when mothers bring up allegations of abuse, they're not believed. Therefore, they are getting jail time. They're creating harmful outcome cases, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. They're giving mothers financial sanctions. And it's really hard because of this retaliation. It's really hard for protective mothers to find good attorneys, because even attorneys are afraid to present evidence of abuse because they've seen how that is retaliated against in the family court system, and that mothers are usually not believed when they're giving allegations, and even if when they have evidence of abuse. And so this is really hurting the entire system. And when we talk about harmful outcome cases, we're talking about a section in the Saunders study, um, and this is a situation where an abusive father gains custody and a protective mother who is the primary attachment figure is limited to supervised or no contact with their children. And what the Saunders study said is this is always wrong. And it's always wrong because any benefit the court believes that it's doing with this outcome is far outweighed by the consequences that it causes. Children who are not allowed a normal relationship with their primary attachment figure are at high increased risk of anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, suicide, and even later in life, things like cancer and heart disease is what we talked about in last week's presentation. So if you didn't see that, go back and look at that. But we really want to make sure, most importantly, that we are not allowing courts to continue with these extreme decisions that are based on flawed practices like these harmful outcome cases. All right, Barry.
Okay, so now we're going to go to the actual figures that help show the conclusions that we made. And it's important, we've all seen many statistics about the frequency of domestic violence, and they're almost always understated because DV is the most underreported crime. And that's why statistics about homicides are particularly helpful in understanding domestic violence. You know, there's a body. She's not lying about her partner murdering her. And that makes it easier to understand the extent of domestic violence in our society. And when I was teaching in the Battle program, we often talked about these statistics because it really helps us understand domestic violence and the differences between men and women in terms of how domestic violence, works. And so in 1976, which was around the start of the modern domestic violence movement, 1,600 women and 1,357 men were murdered by their intimate partners. And because of the reforms that Veronica talked about near the start of this presentation, it made it easier for victims to leave their abuser. And as a result, for 3 decades, there was a steady decline in DV homicides, so that by 2005, 1,181 women and 329 men were murdered. And there's a couple of things we want you to notice in terms of comparing 1976 with 2005. The first thing is, if you look at the total numbers, domestic violence homicide was cut in half. There was huge progress. And for a brief moment, it seemed like maybe we could dramatically reduce DV homicides the way we reduce deaths from cancer and heart disease when we reduce smoking. There was a brief moment when we thought some really wonderful things were possible. And that's when the abusers started using their tactics. And I know they started before 2005, but it started to play out more. And those tactics stopped the progress that we were making and reversed it. And I want to, and so before we get to 2021, the other thing we want to talk about is the significance reforms that were designed to help women leave abusive parents, abusive men, instead reduce the number of men murdered more than the number of women murders. It's interesting, over 1,000 men's lives were saved in the distinction between 76 and 2005, and a little over 400 women. And to be clear, we don't want anyone murdered. We want to save men, we want to save women. We don't want any confusion about that. But it's worth thinking about, why is it that these reforms that were designed to help women saved so many more men's lives? And what we saw at the time was that abusive men would be telling their partners, "You'll never get away, no one's going to believe you, you're just going to have to stay with me forever." And it made women believe that the only way to stop his abuse was to kill him. And that's why, when they were given other options so that they could leave, so that they could escape, there was no need to kill men to end the domestic violence. And that's important to understand. And there's one other thing I want to emphasize here. In our society, in our legal system, we use a definition of self-defense that is a men's definition. If we think about it, in most cases, the man is bigger and stronger. But the law says you can't use self-defense measures until you're attacked. So what that means is, if a woman waits to be attacked, he has the surprise, he's bigger and stronger, she's dead. If a man waits until he's attacked, she has the surprise, he's bigger and stronger, he has a chance to survive. What that means is that when we look at these statistics, they're based on murders, convictions, so that many of the men who were murdered, it was really a form of self-defense, even if it didn't rise to the men's definition. And I just thought we should have that context. Now, to complete these statistics, for 3 decades, we had a steady decline until the success of abusive fathers in the courts reversed that. So that by 2021, 1,690 women and 1,078 men were murdered by their partners. And what that shows, when you look at the number of women murdered, all of that wonderful progress that we had made was lost, and still more women died. And that's a big part of how we know that there is a connection between child custody failures and DV homicides. Go to the next slide. There's more evidence of what we're saying. One of the best places to look for this information is Dutchess County, New York. And they are among many, many counties with a particularly bad custody court. And there were complaints for years. But what ultimately happened was, I think it was around 2009, there was a period of 1 year where they suffered 9 deaths, and there were 5 women. 3 of the men killed themselves after killing their partner, and there was a police officer who rescued a child whose mother had just been murdered by the father, and then the father killed the police officer. And in response to these murders, Dutchess County legislator decided to create a citizens committee to investigate the county response to domestic violence. And they issued a very detailed, lengthy report that went into many issues. It wasn't just custody courts. But what they found was that the custody courts in Dutchess County were very influenced by fathers' rights groups, by unscientific alienation theories. As a result, many women either never went to court, or if they did, they stopped because they found that the courts made things worse. The women found that it was better to try to deal with their abuser by themselves than to have the judge helping the abuser, which is what was happening in Dutchess County. And many women who decided to stay, did not survive that decision because they didn't have any good choice. And so one of the findings by this committee was that the failure of the custody courts in Dutchess County was one of the main factors in causing, this series of DV homicides. I want to give you 2 other local pieces of information. Quincy, Massachusetts, many of you know, is one of the first and best communities in terms of a model to prevent DV homicides. They used the group of best practices so that a county that had averaged 5 to 6 DV homicides every year had several years in a row with no murders. And when I interviewed the district attorney, Bill Delahunt, he told me that when abusive fathers sought custody, the victims stopped cooperating with prosecutors. That did not ruin the success in Quincy, because at that time, and the Quincy model ran from 1978 to 1995, at that time, this was a rare tactic. And of course, today it's a standard tactic for abusers to go after custody to regain control. One other more recent thing I wanted to share with you, some of you may have noticed, a couple weeks ago, there was a news article about the district attorney in Denver creating a domestic violence office within the DA's office. And the explanation was that there was a huge increase in DV homicides in Denver at the same time that that other murders were down. And this is true nationally also, that the same time we're seeing the huge increase in domestic violence homicides, other murders are down. And that's how we know that it's the failure of the custody courts that is causing these catastrophes. More broadly, we want to talk about the harm and the pain caused by custody court failures. One of the statistics we frequently mention is that in the last 16 years, more than 1,000 children involved in contested custody cases have been murdered, mostly by abusive fathers. And in many of those cases, the courts, using the flawed practices, gave the murderer the access he needed to kill the children. There's another study, it comes from the Leadership Council, was done by Dr. Joyce Silberg, and it found that every year, 58,000 children are sent to dangerous abusers, either for custody or unprotected visitation. And of course, most of these children are not murdered, but that doesn't mean their lives aren't affected, aren't shortened, because what tends to happen is the fear and stress impact the children. Many of these children die in their teens or 20s from suicide, substance abuse, accidents, things like that. Other children, may survive that period of time, but then they'll lose their lives to cancer or heart disease, other diseases that are connected with the stress that domestic violence and child abuse causes. So it's a huge harm that is created by the custody courts in addition to the DV homicides that they help to create by denying women the ability to escape from their abusers. Veronica?
Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about what we can do about all of these things we're talking about. Well, how can we take action? There's a lot of people on this webinar who work in this space, and we can talk about things that can change the system, that can help what we're talking about and reverse those numbers back again. So we're going to say it starts with family courts right now, because we really need to enact reforms by using the right experts in the courtrooms, not people who don't understand domestic violence, who ignore evidence of abuse, who basically make a lot of money when they are on the side of abusive fathers, because abuse is about control, and that includes financial control. So a lot of times the money is on the side of the abusive parents. But reforms that we can make in the family court system start with looking at evidentiary hearings that just go over the evidence of abuse before deciding any custody issues. Again, using the right experts and training judges, guardian ad litems, other people who are involved, custody evaluators, in the current scientific research, particularly ACE and Saunders, so they understand what's really going on here. Again, abusers tend to be very manipulative. They lie, they are charming. So a lot of times court professionals are manipulated by abusers, and they believe what they are saying. And with gender bias, men tend to get more credibility off the cuff. And so there is the myth that mothers frequently make false reports of abuse, and abusive fathers have used that myth to gain control and to go after and seek custody. And again, I want to emphasize that when we're talking about these types of cases, we're not talking about two safe parents, two reasonable adults who can put their differences aside for the good of the children. We're talking about the worst possible abusers who are seeking custody to punish mothers for leaving the relationship or reporting their abuse, and they are willing to hurt the children in order to regain back their control. And then legislators, we can certainly make reforms in laws to require domestic violence custody reforms. Again, there's the Cadence Law, which is the federal Cadence Law that was part of the authorization of the Violence Against Women Act that was done in Congress a couple of years ago. And some states have adopted versions of Cadence Law, and that's certainly a step in the right direction. And we need more laws like that. In fact, Barry and I will be testifying later today in Arizona for the legislator there, who are doing ad hoc committee meetings, several of them, and listening to survivors of domestic violence who have been through the custody court system and have had harmful outcome cases, and who have been traumatized by the courts because the courts are allowing abusers to continue their abuse through the court system. So there are ways we can do that. There are people out there that are trying to make changes, and so that's hopeful. We want the domestic violence movement to really prioritize custody There is a lot of work being done to help victims and survivors and their children, and we really need to work in conjunction with the custody courts so that women can escape knowing that their children are going to be safe, because so often we hear in this work that women say, I should have stayed. I can continue the beatings, I can continue with the coercive control as long as I'm there to protect my children. And it really, that's why we're saying it increases the domestic violence homicide rates, because women are choosing to stay instead of leaving that abusive father or that abusive man in their life, their intimate partner, because they do not want their children to be unsupervised with them. They do not want to have their children be exposed to further abuse, not just from the perpetrator himself, but when they go into other relationships, they're not going to change. These children are going to be exposed to more violence and more domestic violence in that perpetrator's next relationship as well. So, we want women to stay alive. We want women to be able to escape. And the failure of the courts are not allowing women to do that right now in a safe way. And women are losing custody of their children because of these practices. So the media is the next thing. We've seen better and more media talking about these issues. We've seen better language, although the language in media needs to improve as far as who the abuser is and consequences and accountability for abusers rather than victim blaming and things like that. I mean, we all probably know about the Gabby Petito case and how we victim blame, and how just society in general doesn't really understand the dynamics of domestic violence. And they certainly don't understand the family court system and how it's really failing in these areas. And so I think more exposure with the media, uh, being able to put a light on these issues is important. And we've seen a couple of recent media articles that are talking about the increase in the domestic homicides rates. And what we're seeing in these articles is that they're saying, well, we don't know why this is happening. We're seeing other murders go down, but we're seeing domestic violence homicides go up. And we're reaching out to them and saying, hey, I think we have an answer for you. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why these domestic violence homicide rates are going up. And we really feel that there is a definite link to child custody and family court systems who have these outdated practices, and we're not moving forward with the new research and evidence-based solutions. So medical professionals, they are, they're in a position to be people who can look at evidence of abuse, understand evidence of abuse when children are coming in with signs of abuse. And medical professionals need to be willing to educate the public. They need to be willing to testify and stand up for victims and their children in criminal cases as well as civil and family court custody cases, so that their expertise can be used in a way to help victims be believed in family court, and to help victims be able to present evidence in a way that judges can hear and not just ignore them. So I think medical professionals have a huge opportunity to not only continue to use ACE, because I'm seeing more medical professionals using things like the ACE research, which is great because they're able to understand how trauma affects and impacts children. But I think we need to take that a step further and ask medical professionals to be a part of the solution in decreasing these domestic violence homicides by being experts and professionals in these cases where it's needed. We need to obviously protect funding for domestic violence programs, and I'm happy to hear that domesticshelters.org is getting grants and things to help educate people and to provide trainings, and that is wonderful. We need to obviously all be able to help protect this funding for these types of movements and for custody reforms, for law reforms and things like that. And most of all, I just want to say that uh, because most people are unaware of the problems in family court, and I have to say personally, I was unaware of it until I went through it myself. So it's not hard to believe that the general public, probably not the people we're speaking to today, but most of the general public just don't understand what really goes on. And I think we all kind of go into court thinking that justice will be served. And a lot of times that's just not the case for protective parents, particularly mothers who are victims of domestic violence, children who are experiencing child abuse. And there's all these outdated ideological and subjective opinions that are being made in family court, but what they're really needing is objective opinions that are based on good scientific research, and they're not getting that most of the time. So, society as a whole, I think that we can come together in all of these facets to make some change, to start moving forward, and to start protecting children a little bit better. So, I'm going to open it up for questions. Here's our contact information, Barry's email, my email, our website. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Goldstein and York, DV Experts LLC. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any suggestions, any way we can collaborate, any way we can educate the public and get this information out there, because I think just the more people who are talking about it, we'll be able to make some changes. Barry, did you have anything before we have Ashley see if we have any questions?
But I saw one of the questions asked the study about the false reports, and that's the BALA study, BALA. So you have one question answered. Let's go to some others.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you spell that one more time? I'll type it in the chat. B-A.
LA, BALA.
Okay, study. Thank you. Wonderful. Yes. So we do have a lot of questions. So let's dive right in. The first one is, so how can we get judges to learn and understand these abusers' tactics or to be properly trained? Someone weighed in and said they had so a few versions of this question, but one attendee shared that they are in Colorado, which enacted Caden's law, but they're seeing an unwillingness from judges to learn from DV/child abuse experts as they prefer training from peer judges. So any thoughts on that? Are you seeing the same? Okay, seeing some nods there. Any thoughts on how they could approach this issue?
Well, that is a problem. We've worked with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and what we learned is that very often judges don't want to listen unless it's another judge, which is a problem. There's a few judges that have a good understanding of domestic violence, but that's certainly a minority. One of the reasons that Veronica and I do the work we do is that when we testify, the judge and the other court professionals get to hear the right information. We, have that can be a way of helping things. Maybe this isn't the right place, or maybe it is. I was thinking several years ago, when Rita Smith was the head of the NCADV, we did a training for advocates, and it was co-sponsored with NCADV and the Battered Mothers Custody Conference and the National Organization for Men Against Sexism, and the California Protective Parents Association. We did a training for advocates to become expert witnesses. Because advocates already have the DV knowledge. We just have to give them the context and the legalities and things like that. So it doesn't require a huge amount. And what that would mean is that you'd have all over the country, you would have experts that mothers could afford, because it probably wouldn't be a charge, although maybe women who could afford it would make contributions to the DV organizations to show appreciation. But that might be something we could do through domestic shelters, and put together a program and give certificates for advocates that complete such a program. And that way there would be so many more expert witnesses available for protective mothers. So that might be a way to do it. We're also, I'm thinking, and there was another question about how to get this information out. And we can put together, and I think we have some articles and, where it's a shorter piece of information, and maybe the local DV agencies could be sending these articles, particularly to the administrative judges. But there's nothing unethical if they're sending information not about a particular case, but just generally about the research. And so maybe we can work together to do some of these things.
Yeah, so you're saying essentially just continue to educate judges through peer-reviewed and very like just objective information, right? It's not so much you're saying this case you did it wrong, you did something wrong, but hey, did you understand that this is the realities of abuse, or this is the realities of how an abuser abuses. So I think those are both two really great points. And I just kind of looking at the chat as you were speaking, and a lot of people were saying great ideas. So I agree with you there. Let's try to get a couple more questions in here. Hannah had written down, so we hear a lot about protection orders from both survivors and advocates. So can you talk about what can be done when a protection order is not being enforced or the judge themselves seems to undermine it? So a judge has to sign off on a protective order, right? But then they go and they kind of undermine themselves in not enforcing it. Any thoughts on, I guess that's more law enforcement, but any thoughts on how to get judges to take them seriously?
We're not attorneys, so we can't give any legal advice or anything like that. But what we do talk about is that, judges tend to look at domestic violence as just physical. And so when we're talking about domestic violence, we want judges to understand that it's way more than that. Obviously, coercive control. Obviously, most domestic violence is neither physical nor illegal. And so when we're looking at ways to help abusers change their behavior, right? A protective order is one way. Hopefully, it can be enforceable on a criminal sense if they're violating that protection order, that you can take them back to court to enforce that or to have accountability for that. And I think that's what I want to talk about, is that research shows that only accountability and monitoring can change an abuser's behavior. So if we're looking at things like protection orders, hopefully we can hold that person accountable for violating those orders. But also on the civil side or a family court side, we definitely want to be talking about how abusers cannot be changed by things like anger management issues or therapy. They really need to have an accountability program. And so best practices based on the research is that they would complete a 52-week accountability program, which can be a batterer program, but it would be focused on accountability rather than therapy or anger management and things like that are not the cause of domestic violence. And I think when we talk about accountability and monitoring, we want orders, particularly custody orders, written in such a way that they are enforceable with accountability and with monitoring. So there are consequences that are written in for not not doing what the order says, because a lot of times I do think that abusers in general just don't believe that the rules apply to them. So they're not going to do any of the things they're required to do unless there is accountability and unless there is monitoring of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. About a minute left, so I'm going to give you guys a chance if there's anything else you want to add, and then I'll go ahead and wrap up.
One other thing in the last question, we sometimes like to share with the courts the consequences of not taking domestic violence seriously. The fact that so many children are murdered, the fact that the children that initially survive are going to have shorter lives. When we testify and we give the child's ACE score, and what we're saying is, if you do the usual things and don't protect this child, if you allow the father to have unprotected contact, this child is going to lose years from his life or her life, and their life is going to be much less healthy. that's a really compelling statement. As much as we are frustrated with judges, no judge wants to hurt children. Just a lot of them don't understand that what they're doing is hurting children. And
Yeah.
so explaining the risks and putting it on the record so the judge knows if they don't provide protection and anything happens, it's on the judge. That's his career or her career.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well said. Well, we'll end with that. So thank you so much, Barry and Veronica. Just a reminder, we'll be back next week, same time on Thursday, to discuss the high costs that we pay to tolerate domestic violence. A link to register is in the chat as we're wrapping up here. And also keep an eye on your email inbox. We did send out the recording from last week's webinar for anyone here today that was not able to attend last week. So thank you everyone who tuned in today. On behalf of the Alliance for Hope team, we are very grateful to have you all here today. We're just so grateful for all the amazing work that you're doing day in and day out to support survivors of domestic violence. It means so much to us to be able to support you through these free webinars and provide the resources that we do on allianceforhope.org and domesticshelters.org. So wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you back here next week. Thank you so much.